Hello, Mr. Ham here, and I'd like to read to you one of my favourite books when I was a lad growing up, and that's Beyond the Firelight by Anne Lawrence. There was once a rich farmer who had the worst luck in the world. One after another, he lost his money, his land, and then his wife. For a time, he kept going with the little he had left. A fishing boat, a tiny cottage, and just enough land to support a cow, a couple of pigs, and a few hens. But soon, he died too, when his son was still hardly more than a boy. Luckily, young Will had relatives and friends who all wanted to do their best for him. They reckoned that the sale of the cottage and the land should raise enough money to pay for Will to learn a trade. And since his uncle in the nearby town was willing to give him a home, everything seemed to be nicely settled. Except that Will had other ideas. He wanted to stay where he was, living off his cow, his pigs, his fowls, and his fishing, as his father had. "What was enough for two of us should be enough for one," he said. "Why should I work for someone else all my life, when I could be my own master?" In short, he refused to move. First his relatives argued. Then they scolded him for being obstinate and ungrateful. But at last his father's oldest friend said, "Why not let the boy try his luck? The chances are he'll soon find he's bitten off more than he can chew, and he may be glad to take up our suggestions." In the end, they followed his advice. Off they all went, wagging their heads and telling each other that it would only be a matter of weeks before Will came round to beg their pardons. They were right, and they were wrong. Will did soon find out he had bitten off more than he could chew, but chew he would, though it choke him. He made up his mind to starve before he would give up. It was bitter hard work, all the same, and all the harder because there was no one to share it, and no one to say, "Well done," when it was all finished. He worked from dawn to dusk just to scratch a living. His clothes fell in tatters, and the cottage became dirty and uncomfortable, because he had no time to do more than keep himself and a few animals fed. More than once he came near to giving in. More than once a day, if the truth were told. The day when he thought he had made the catch of a lifetime, only to find his net full of seaweed and driftwood, was a day like that. By the time he had rowed back to the beach, he was too tired to sort out the mess of net and weed, and so he left it in a nasty heap at the bottom of the boat. That night, he kicked off his boots and fell asleep on his bed, fully dressed. The cottage was nothing but one large room, with the bed at one end, a table and chairs at the other, and the big fireplace in the middle. The fire was low, and the kettle cold when Will came home, but he could not be bothered to do anything about either. In the early hours of the morning, however, he woke to the flicker of firelight. Propping himself up on one elbow, he saw that the fire had burned up in a big, cheerful blaze. He blinked sleepily, comforted but puzzled. Suddenly his eye was drawn by a movement just beyond the firelight. As he sat up, a strange figure shuffled to the hearth. Will could not tell exactly how tall the creature might be, for it crouched in front of the fire like a dog, its long hands resting on the floor between its huge feet. Its head was large too, and the face lit up by the restless flames was like a crumpled leather bag. Yet its body seemed small and its limbs thin. Probably it would be much shorter than a man if it stood upright, thought Will. It appeared to be dressed in seaweed, unless the ragged strips of brown stuff which covered it were actually growing on it like hair. Then the creature turned and looked towards the bed. Its expression was sad and not at all alarming, but all at once Will's curiosity turned to panic. "Evil spirit! Be gone, in God's name!" he gabbled. Remembering that unearthly things were supposed to fear iron, he grabbed his candlestick from the chest beside the bed and threw it. His strange visitor moved then, sure enough, though it did not vanish in a puff of smoke, but simply shuffled back into the shadows with a hurt look, as anyone might who had a candlestick thrown at him. When Will woke the next morning at sunrise, he thought he must have been dreaming. But there was the fire burning brightly. There was the kettle already boiling for his tea, and there was his candlestick lying in front of the hearth, which had been swept clean. Nevertheless, it was only when he went down to his boat that he was forced to believe in what he had seen, for the tangle of weed he had fished up had gone. The net lay neatly folded. It had even been repaired. From then on, the cottage was always clean, the fire always lit. Will's clothes were quietly washed and mended overnight, and one morning when he overslept, he found the cow had been milked and the eggs collected as well. He seldom saw his helper after the first night, but he had the feeling that he was no longer alone. Now that he did not have to worry about keeping house, Will could turn all his energy to farming and fishing. He was a hard-working lad and things went well for him, so that before long, people stopped wondering when he would give up. Soon it was being said that Will's luck was as good as his father's had been bad. Knowing neighbours told each other that he was bound to get on in the world, though they were probably the same knowing folk who had said just the opposite not 12 months before. In the spring of the following year, Will found he had time to go to church more often than he had lately, and somehow he always seemed to walk home with the same bright-faced girl. She was the daughter of the neighbour who had advised Will's family to let him go his own way, and seeing how well the lad was making out, the good farmer had no reason to regret his words. Will became busier than ever. He built another room on the cottage, he rented more land from his friendly neighbour and bought more animals, and in due course he asked Joan to marry him. Naturally, Joan took a great interest in her future home. "A sad muddle it must be," she said happily. "Men can never look after themselves." She was very surprised to find the cottage as clean and neat as a new pin. She marvelled how Will had found time to do everything. Bad Will smiled modestly and said, "Oh, there's always time if you organise things properly." Joan was a little put out. She hoped she would be able to organise the housework so well when she took over. However, she soon found work enough to satisfy her, for though clean, the place was bare of comforts. She sewed tirelessly to make curtains, cushions, tablecloths and sheets, and she was delighted to see how cheerful the little house looked when she had smartened it up. At last, they were married. The first morning after Will brought her home, Joan rose early and tied on her apron, ready to prove herself as good a housekeeper as Will. But the floors were swept and the fire was already made. That night after supper, Will said, "Leave the dishes for now." And it was not until next morning that she remembered them. By then, they had been done. When on the third morning she found that all their clothes had been washed and ironed and were airing in front of the fire, Joan decided the joke had gone far enough. "Will, you've shown me how well you keep house," she said. "Now leave it to me." "Why worry?" said Will airily. But Joan would not be put off. "Because it's my job now," she insisted. Then Will looked uneasy. Well, yes," he said, and then, "Oh, all right. I'll show you tonight, then you'll understand." And though Joan was bursting with curiosity, he would not say another word about it. That night, as the clock struck midnight, Will woke Joan and, finger on lips, he opened the bedroom door a crack so that she could peep into the living room and see the housekeeper at work. He had not changed in the years since Will had first seen him, except that he looked happier. Indeed, he pursed his lips as he went about his work, as if he were whistling, although they could hear no sound. Will closed the door softly. "There," he said, "and he's quite harmless. Even has salt in his porridge. Nothing wicked could stand that." Joan did not know what to say at first. To have a servant was very fine, but such a one! Then again, she was glad to find that Will was not so clever after all, but she was less pleased about the way he had let her believe he was. Still, in the end, she had to agree that it was a very handy arrangement. All the same, she could not take Will's housekeeper as much for granted as he did. She wondered how happy it was really, and always added a good splash of cream to the porridge Will left on the hearth each night. One day she said, "Will, I don't think we do enough for him." "Who?" said Will. "Him, who does the work." "We feed him," said Will. "What else can we do?" "Well, what about clothes?" said Joan. "He's only got those weedy rags, if they are clothes at all." "That's the way he is." Will looked doubtful. "I think you should leave Will alone." But Joan had an idea. One night, a few weeks later, she laid a small pair of trousers and a good jersey, all of her own making, next to the plate on the hearth. They waited at the bedroom door to see what the creature would make of her gift. At first, he did not seem to realise that the clothes were for him. He patted them, he fingered them. He seemed to be trying to remember something. Then he held the jersey against himself and turned towards the bedroom door. Joan was amazed to see enormous tears rolling down the leathery cheeks. Slowly he dressed, all the time shaking his head and muttering soundlessly. Then with one last look at the bedroom, he shuffled out. "There," said Will. "Now you'll have to do the housework whether you like it or not." "What?" Joan stared at him. "Why?" "Because you've just paid off our housekeeper. According to the stories, if you give clothes to a house fairy, it goes away." "Fairy? That?" Joan exclaimed. "He must be something of that sort," said Will. "Poor old thing. He probably thought you wanted to get rid of him." Joan was very upset. "He mustn't think that," she cried. She thought hard for a minute. Perhaps giving him clothes doesn't get rid of things like him. Perhaps it sets them free. Perhaps he had to serve you when you caught him like that. He might be sorry to leave us, but still be glad to be free." "He always seemed happy enough," said Will. But he was a shade uneasy. "Anyway, he's gone now. You should have left things alone, as I said." "I wonder what he was really," said Joan. Will was right. Whatever the reasons for the creature's long service, Joan's gift ended it. But though the fire was no longer tended, nor the housework done quietly in the night, the good luck stayed with them. Indeed, sometimes when she was alone in the house, Joan was not sure that he really had gone altogether. Something kindly seemed to come and go, maybe visiting as a friend, she thought, now that he was no longer bound as a servant. Thank you for listening, everyone. That was Beyond the Firelight.